Welcome back to the Go Have Good Sex podcast, the show where faith and pleasure finally stop fighting. I'm Angela, the Christian sexpert, sex coach, truth teller, and your new favorite bedtime devotional. If you're ready to go deeper, check out my resources for couples and individuals, from my free 15-minute coaching consults to spicy but faith-friendly resources like the Marriage Playdate, to my Patreon, where I teach you all the things your church aunties never told you about. And yeah, you know I've got it covered with merch, journals, bookmarks, and everything in between at thechristiansexpert.com. So whether you're here to learn, to heal, or to spice things up with scripture and sass, I'm your girl, and I'm so glad you're here. Let's get into today's episode, and remember, go have good sex. If the thought of talking about sex with your spouse makes you tense up, or you've been married for years and you still don't know how to start that conversation, girl, you're not alone. So many couples have come into marriage and they followed all the rules, but without ever being given the language, safety, or permission to actually talk about sex. And then they wonder why everything feels awkward, tense, or off limits. Today, we're talking about how to start talking about sex when you never have before, without fighting, freezing, or the shame of feeling like you're doing something wrong, even though you've been married 20 years. This episode is for couples who love each other, who want connection, and they don't know where to begin. I want you to hear this first. You're not broken. You're not failing. You're not somehow behind. You just weren't taught how to do this safely. So let's talk about how to talk about sex. Let's talk about sex, baby. Let's talk about you and me. It's not just a 90s song. If you are anything like the majority of my followers, you were probably raised in some sort of purity culture. And don't forget, purity culture is not biblical purity. That's an argument for another day. But one of the hallmarks of purity culture was you weren't allowed to talk about sex. Any sort of discussion of sex beyond that's for married people, don't do it, was deemed shameful, or you were playing with fire. You were condemned for being too curious, right? And so all that we were given for a framework in talking about sex was rules. There weren't conversations. And so you were taught what not to do, but you were never taught what to do. One of the biggest things that I learned when I had a toddler and trying to teach my toddler how to not tear my house apart or not run into the road, whatever. The most mind-blowing lesson that I learned very early on was when you tell your toddler, don't run, the only part that their brain actually processes is the last thing that was said. So it was run. And that's why they keep running. When you say don't run, they keep running, right? It's infuriating because in your mind, you're like, well, if I'm saying don't run, they should be able to do the logical leap to say, oh, don't run means I should walk. They have to flip that to the inverse, the opposite. I don't know what the word is, but you guys know what I mean. And so when it comes to these conversations about sex, we were told, don't talk about it, don't talk about it. But we weren't taught what to do instead. Side note, if you have a toddler, instead of saying don't run, that's why you need to tell them we need to walk right now. So, or walk, please walk, right? So the walk is what they're focused on instead of hearing run. Complete parenting bonus tip of the day. But the problem is that we now have an entire generation of adults who were never taught to have a conversation about sex. We were never taught how to talk about sex because no one talked to us about sex. I know that like the entirety of the sex ed talk I had was being handed a book and my parent walking away. And I mean, it was the 90s and we weren't even like deep Christians. Like the denomination I was raised in is a whole other story. But like we were not evangelical Christians in the purity culture movement. And there was still no real sex education because the adults in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, I'm so old that some of you were raised in the 2010s and are married now. Yeah, 20, well, okay, maybe not 2010s. I don't know. Math is hard, y'all. But anyhow, some of you were like born after I got married because I've been married for over 20 years and that's scary. The point is, nobody talked to us about how to talk about sex. And so obviously you don't have a framework. You don't know what to do. It feels scary because if all the messaging that you have internalized is it's shameful, don't talk about it, only slutty girls talk about sex, right? Of course you don't know how to do it. And so it feels awkward. And we as a species want to avoid awkwardness. We don't lean into things that are awkward. So even though like you know that it's okay to talk about sex with your spouse and you want to and you know that you should, it feels awkward, so you continue to avoid it. And this is what is leading to a lot of the larger issues in sex and marriage is you feel like something's wrong or you want something more, but you don't know how to bring up the conversation. You're afraid of hurting their feelings, whatever. And so instead of talking about the issue, you continue to avoid it. And sex becomes a performance instead of a deeper way to communicate without words. So it isn't that you don't want to talk about it, and it's not that you are bad at talking about it. You just don't have the skills yet, and that's okay. Some of the biggest mistakes that I see couples making when it comes to trying to talk about sex or communicate about sex is waiting until there's conflict or feelings of rejection or resentment. You can't wait until one of you is hurt or hurting to start talking. Another really common issue that I see is when someone leads with blame or defensiveness. That's another huge issue in communication about sex. Or even like a scarcity mindset. Like I, I see I see a scarcity mindset more often from men when we're talking about communication about sex because they think, well, she said that she doesn't want to have sex with me. And if she can say no to sex this one time, I'll never have sex again. I don't like your jump. That's a big leap. I hope you aren't breaking a hip with that leap of logic. And that sort of panic, that sort of scarcity mindset does not invite further communication. It shuts it down. Because really, how can you respond to someone when they're being that dramatic? The problem is sex and communication about sex really requires a well regulated nervous system. And so, if the only time that you are trying to communicate about sex or you are communicating about sex is when one or both of you is dysregulated, you are teaching your body and your nervous system that this sort of communication is not safe. And so, the next time you try and communicate or you try and have sex, your nervous system is going to be going, this doesn't feel safe. It didn't feel safe last time, doesn't feel safe now. So you're literally like starting to teach your body that these conversations are dangerous. And that's not going to lead to a good outcome for anyone or any sort of outcome that anyone wants to be having. A lot of times when I'm talking to clients about talking about sex, they tell me that they're scared to start because they think they have to just dive in with like their deepest, darkest fantasy.
And they'll say things like, but Angela, I am afraid to tell my husband that I want to swing naked from a chandelier while wearing pasties and lip syncing some 80s hairband. And I think he's going to think that I'm weird. And then he'll reject me because I'm being weird. And babe, it doesn't have to start with your deepest, darkest fantasy. Like, there's so much to unpack here. All right. So, it doesn't have to start with your deepest, darkest fantasy. And I think that one of the other places that we really start to run into problems when we talking about sex is so many people, while they haven't been taught how to talk about it, they are deeply afraid of rejection if they talk about it. They are deeply afraid that if they start talking to their spouse about what they want in bed, that their spouse will think that they are either too kinky or not kinky enough and reject them. And that that isn't where you start. If you are new to talking to your spouse about sex, you don't just dive in with the craziest thing that you play with in your imagination. Unless you have that type of marriage, in which case I don't think that you need my help to talk about sex. This probably isn't a problem you have if you have the type of marriage where you feel like you can just dive in with the craziest thoughts that run through your head. You start a whole lot smaller. You start with curiosity. And it can be as simple as, hey, what did you learn about sex when you were growing up? Like, how did your parents have those conversations with you? Did your parents have those conversations with you at all? Or did you have to learn from your peers? Did you have to learn from the internet? Like, what were those messages? And then you can start with, when we talk about sex, what feels like the easiest thing to talk about? And maybe it's not even like sex. Maybe it's like the bedroom, right? You could talk about, hey, I feel like it would be helpful for me to really cultivate a more peaceful atmosphere in our bedroom. So maybe we need to add some lamps instead of overhead lighting. That might make me feel a little more comfortable, right? And that's sort of talking around the issue that isn't necessarily addressing like sex directly. And it's kind of easing you into the conversation. The thing is, if you are just starting out, don't talk about your bodies explicitly. Talk about the other things surrounding those things that feel more intimate. So here's the biggest tool that I give to my clients when we are talking about sex. And that is a sex journal. And I struggle because this episode is not meant to be a sales pitch, but I have written a sex journal. And there's a lot of reasons why. When you haven't been taught how to talk about sex, giving your brain and your nervous system a framework to start in feels easier because it doesn't feel like you have to come up with everything from scratch, right? It's, oh, well, the journal is asking me these questions. It's not, it's less pressure when it's coming from an outside source. And the other thing is, if you weren't taught how to talk about sex, a lot of times you will lack the language to even start having those conversations. In fact, in her book, She Deserves Better, Sheila Wray Gregoire found that girls who are raised in purity culture have less sexual education language, vocabulary than their non-purity culture counterparts. So you may even lack a framework for the language to talk about sex. And so that's why a guided sex journal can help you It can give you the language. It gives you the prompts. Okay, so let me just tell you the way that my journal works. All right. So it's called Intimate Conversations. It has over 100 prompts in it. And the way that it works is you go through, you pick a prompt, and it could be something like, this is my favorite type of date, or the first thing I loved about you was, right? They're not all like, tell me your deepest fantasy that you've never told me. I mean, that one's in there, but they're not all super intense questions. And what you'll do is you will sit down, you'll look at a prompt, and then you're going to write out your response. And if you are a super, super type A person, you can write out your response on like scrap paper and then edit it and then put it into the journal if that makes you feel better. Like you can decide what you want to actually put into the journal. And that gives your brain kind of like space to breathe. It gives your nervous system a chance to calm down as you're writing this out. And then what you do is you give it to your spouse. And guys, don't make it weird. Don't sit there and stare into their soul while they're reading it. Do like toss it under their pillow or, leave it on their nightstand and give them space and privacy to read it. And that allows their nervous system time to chill out. And it allows their nervous system time to process and say, I'm not being attacked. She is just communicating information, right? And going back to, we're afraid of rejection. We're afraid to communicate because we're afraid of rejection. The journal doesn't completely, but it helps mitigate that situation, because what you're really afraid of is seeing a look of, ew, why would you want that on your spouse's face, right? And so even though statistically it's unlikely that your spouse would react that way if you're married to a good spouse, them reading the journal, even if they do have that reaction, gives them a chance to get their face under control before they respond to you. So even if they have a moment of, oh, I had no idea that was something that they would be into, they can get that under control before they ever come back to you. And so what they're going to do is they're going to read the prompt. They're going to write out their answer to that prompt. But what they're also going to do is they're going to get curious about their response. And they're going to say, oh my gosh, I had no idea that you were interested in hanging from a chandelier while singing 80s rock ballads. What is it about that appeals to you? And the biggest thing in these conversations is leading with curiosity and not judgment. And so they have that opportunity with the journal to respond with curiosity, to say, I didn't know that was something that you might be interested in. What is it about it that appeals to you? And that passing of the journal back and forth, the more that you engage with it, the more that time that you invest in passing it back and forth, the more your language and your vocabulary is going to start to develop, the more confidence you're going to have in taking these conversations from the journal to verbal conversations, because it's also going to start happening naturally, because now you're going to be like, oh, well, they talked about what their perfect bedroom setup would be in the journal. And hey, I'm at the store and I found these super cute lamps that, they said they want to get more lamps for the bedroom. So I'm just going to grab these. And then you get to come home and be like, hey, in the journal, you said you'd wanted lamps for the bedroom. I found these. If you don't like them, we can return them, but I thought they were cute. Let's set them up together. Right? And so naturally, those conversations are going to start coming out of the journal and into your everyday conversations with each other. And it's a natural progression. And the other thing about using a journal is you don't have to be worried about like giving the right answer or giving the right response. So, like I said, it could be the, oh, ew, I didn't know that you were interested in that sort of face. Like my face says everything that my mouth doesn't. So if my mouth doesn't say it, my face is going to. So a journal mitigates that sort of risk. But the other thing is, if your spouse asks you, hey, would you be interested in this? You don't have to worry about, well, I don't know if I'd be interested in this, but if I don't say yes, they're going to take that as a rejection. And then like frantically trying to come up with the right answer to respond to them. So it also takes the pressure off of you of having to like come up with the right answer, the right response, or whatever, and gives you time to slow down and process as well. One of the things that I see come up a lot in conversations when we're talking about sex, or even talking about exploring other activities or things in the bedroom, is oftentimes there's one partner that has more anxiety about having the conversations, or they feel more shame about the conversations, or one partner wants to try, they get like super excited and like, oh, I want to try these 16 different things with you. And the other partner is more reserved and they get really overwhelmed. And that can cause them to shut down. And then the super excited person like perceives that as rejection. And so it's really important that when you start engaging in these conversations, whether it is verbally or with a journal, that you are taking it slow. You guys have an entire lifetime to explore these conversations and activities together. You don't need to have everything out on the table all at once. So if somebody starts to feel flooded, if they start to feel dysregulated, if they start to feel anxious, it's okay to back off and say, you know what, it's cool. Like, we can just wait. We have our entire lives. It doesn't all have to be fixed, solved, talked about, tried in the next week or tonight. We can back up. So it's important to just take it slow, go at a pace that is comfortable for the more anxious, more working through shame or trauma of the two of you. The other thing to remember is that if you are trying to talk them into something, if you're trying to persuade them to talk about it, if you're trying to persuade them to try something, that in this context is going to come off as pressure or obligation. And we know that obligation and pressure kill desire. So be super careful about trying to talk them into it, or persuade them or anything like that, because that's going to have the opposite effect. That's going to cause them to shut down and withdraw. And that's not what we're trying to do here. So this is coming back to the main principle. If you take nothing else from this podcast, it is lead with curiosity. So you say, it seems like you're really reluctant to have this conversation right now. What are you feeling? Where are you feeling that in your body? It seems like you are uncomfortable. Is this triggering something for you that from your past? Like, what's going on? And getting curious about their reluctance or avoidance or anything like that. And really make sure that you have some key phrases that you can fall back on. Like, we don't have to solve everything tonight. We'll come back to this later. Or, let's table this conversation and we'll pick it up on our date night next week, or things like that. The more that someone feels unsafe to even engage in conversations about sex, the less safe they're going to feel to actually have sex at all. So you really need to remember that. And one of the other things that we talked about at the beginning of the show was awkwardness. Humans as a species avoid what makes us feel awkward. But here's the thing. Just embrace the awkwardness. Remember, Hollywood and porn has fed us this script of sex is always effortless and passionate and spontaneous and all of these things. And it never shows an awkward or silly something happening in bed. And a lot of times sex is awkward or something silly happens. I think I've told you guys the story before of how we thought that our puppy was unable to get to our bedroom, and we were mid activities and suddenly there's just a flying squirrel 4-pound dog on my face, and I laughed for 20 minutes. And nobody talks about like that's real life. It's awkward, right? And so just embrace it. The more that you embrace the awkward, the less awkward it's going to feel. And this isn't the same. I know I just said, like, don't pressure. But there's a difference between an internal, oh, this feels awkward, but I need to like embrace it versus your partner like putting pressure on you. I hope that you guys understand that those are two different things. Um, if you are reacting from a place of shame or trauma or a trigger or like deep discomfort, that isn't the same as I feel like a giggly middle schooler trying to talk about the reproductive system in health class right now. Like, those are two different feelings. So, really understanding the difference between them and being willing to push through when it's awkward and just sort of embrace, like, acknowledge it. You can say, I feel super awkward. This, this is silly. I feel silly. I don't feel sexy. You can acknowledge that. You can laugh together and you can keep going. It's fine. And the other thing to remember is that sometimes you might need a little support to start having the conversations about talking about sex. And that's where professionals like myself come in. Or if you feel like you need something a little more than a coach, you feel like you need a therapist to help you start having these conversations because maybe you realize I actually am carrying a lot of trauma and shame from purity culture, and that is what is inhibiting my ability to have these conversations. I have started a list of therapists that I have personally vetted. Right now, my state's serviced with those therapists is a pretty small list, but you can reach out to me to see if I have a therapist that would be a good support for you in, deconstructing from your purity culture trauma and reconstructing in a biblical worldview. I work with clients to talk about these things, to help give structure to your conversations, to help guide the conversations about pleasure. And again, falling back to the Intimate Conversations Journal, I have seen so many couples struggle with their intimate communication when it comes to sex, with not knowing how to start, not knowing what to talk about, not knowing how to talk about it. That's why I created the journal, because I don't want you to be overwhelmed. This isn't something that should be overwhelming. It should be delightful. It should be curiosity and exploration. It should be. Do you ever remember when you were a kid, your parents taking you to a brand new park, right? A brand new playground. The delight and wonder you had exploring the new equipment, even if like your usual playground had a slide and this playground had a slide, just like the novelty of it was exciting. Even though they're both slides, that it's a little different, right? And that sort of like wonder and delight feeling. Discovering new things about you and your spouse's sexuality should bring that sense of wonder and delight, right? Our marriage bed is supposed to be the playground of our marriage, and we have to invest our time talking about the playground of our marriage in order to make it even better. And that's when I give my couples a copy of Intimate Conversations, like that is what I'm hoping for. I am hoping that they experience that wonder and delight, that it starts to come up in their conversations as they learn to have these conversations. So the journal is it's a guided journal. There's over 100 prompts. It's for couples who want to grow closer in this area, but they just need a little support. If this episode felt relieving instead of overwhelming, that's not an accident. Healthy sexual communication doesn't have to start with confidence or boldness. It should start with safety and curiosity. You don't have to fix everything about your sex life in one talk or conversation. You just need a place to start. So you can find intimate conversations linked in the show notes. Reach out to me if you think you need more support than that. And remember, good sex is not built on obligation or silence. It's built on communication. So go have good sex.
That's it for today's episode. You've been blessed and probably slightly scandalized. Now go journal, go text your man, and most of all, don't keep this to yourself. Share it, review it, slide into my DMs. Then grab a journal, a game, or a coaching spot. And remember, Jesus didn't die for you to have boring sex. So go have good sex already.